Hi everyone. All right, so we are back for the second class on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. Uh, as you can see, I'm up in Maine, out of the city, my mom's house, and I'm outside. Hopefully, I can stay warm enough for the next hour and a half. What I want to do is I want to start by recapping a little bit of what we discussed in our live session last week and review a little bit of the main ideas from book 1 and 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Then we're going to get into books 6 and 7 to look a little bit more at what is involved in practical wisdom and think about sort of the nature of the virtuous person. But so let's return to this very important idea that we didn't spend very much time on in the last video, which is Aristotle's thought that virtue is a mean, or I apologize, in this edition, it's translated as the intermediate. So virtue is that which is a mean or an intermediate, right? And what this means is that virtue is the intermediate between two extremes. Right? So what is excellent, the right thing to do, is that which lies between two extremes. And so Aristotle gives us a long list of virtues. The most obvious one, or the one that is discussed the most, is the virtue of courage. And so courage is the intermediate between two extremes, right? Between what is excessive and what is deficient, or so, right, on the one hand, we have the extreme of excess, which is rashness, right? Or, as I said last time, foolhardiness. So an excess of bravery is rashness. The deficiency, the opposite extreme, is cowardice. Right? So we have this sort of spectrum of possible actions with respect to bravery. An excess of bravery is rashness. A deficiency of bravery is cowardice. And courage, the virtue, the excellent action, is what lies between cowardice and rashness. So I think courage is sort of the flagship example because it is an example that has two obvious extremes. An overabundance of courage is something that we see often. Foolhardiness, right? You get yourself killed through foolhardiness or rashness. And obviously we experience cowardice very often, right? So we experience courage most immediately of Aristotle's virtues as this intermediate between extremes. And so we have some other examples of this, right? Obviously. We have the example of temperance, which is also, right, could be understood as moderation. To be temperate, to be moderate, is to be in the middle between, again, two extremes. On the one hand, we have the extreme of excess, which is licentiousness or promiscuity, is another translation. That which is outside the sort of normal scope of desire, right? So temperance is about your desires, tempering your desires, moderating your desires. Licentiousness, promiscuity are an excessive amount of desire, right? And the deficiency, the opposite extreme would be insensibility, or being insensate, right? Being unable to experience pleasure. Um, and so I think we can see this, we can relate to this also, right? That it is not virtuous, it's not good to be incapable of experiencing pleasure or to shun pleasure altogether. But it's also not good to desire too much pleasure or to pursue too much pleasure. And so you want the right amount of pleasure, which is a moderate amount of pleasure, and that is the virtue of temperance. Right. So I'll post a list of all these virtues and their two extremes of excess and deficiency. Right. Let's go through one more. Right. Patience is a virtue, right? Very famous virtue. And Aristotle interprets patience also to be an intermediate between two extremes. The excessive extreme is irascibility, right? Or quick-temperedness, right? Inability to be patient, right? If you're overly irritable, if you get angry within the first 5 minutes of waiting in a traffic jam or whatever it is, right? That is not a virtue. That is an excessive amount of what Aristotle calls spiritedness. But we can also have too little anger, or be too slow to act, right? To have too much patience, we might say. And Aristotle calls this a lack of spirit, right? If you are willing to tolerate something indefinitely, that's also not a virtue, right? And so if you are never upset by waiting in a traffic jam for 3 days or whatever, that is also not virtuous, right? That's not enough anger or reactiveness. And this is, I think, even more interestingly than the fact that Aristotle thinks a certain amount of pleasure is good and virtuous, right? That the virtuous person pursues a moderate amount of pleasure, doesn't shun all pleasure. Aristotle also thinks that a certain amount of anger is virtuous, right? That it's not virtuous to never be angry, but the virtuous person has anger about the right things at the right time and in the right way. So again, a moderate amount of anger, the right amount of anger, is virtuous. And I think that's really sort of a nice way to think about ethics, and it really, in some ways, sums up a lot of Aristotle's thought on ethics. Right, that it's not that there are certain behaviors that you should never engage in, right, and it's not that right, you have to sort of avoid certain things in every case. There are no hard and fast rules like that. Never get angry. Always be patient. Right. There are times when the situation calls for anger. There are times when the situation calls for impatience, and the virtuous person knows when to be angry, when to be impatient. But all of that, again, depends on an evaluation of the situation, of the particularity of the situation. And so, right, when I was illustrating this, I gave in our group meeting the discussion of the example of a burning building, right? And you can imagine you come home to your house, and your house is on fire. And you need to decide whether or not you're going to rush into the burning building, or if the right thing to do is to stay out. Right? So there is no sort of rule about what the right thing to do is in that situation. Right? It will entirely depend on the circumstances, and right, if the house is extremely on fire, and there's nothing valuable in there, then the right thing to do is to stay out, right? The courageous thing to do is to stay out, right? And to, bravely suffer, witness your house burning. Uh, if the house is only a little bit on fire, and your grandmother is inside, then the courageous thing to do is to rush in and try and save her, right? So the point is the conditions, the particularities of the situation will determine what the intermediate is, right? Um, so, it's not that there is a kind of fixed scale, and this kind of action is in every case extreme. This kind of action is in every case extreme. Extreme deficiency, extreme excess. What counts as excessive and deficient is going to change based on the situation. So, right, this is why we need to develop our practical wisdom, which is the kind of knowledge that we need in order to evaluate these particulars, the situation. And I want to highlight again that not only is the right thing to do determined by the particular situation, but also by who you are, right? The particularities of you as an individual. Those have to be taken into account also. What am I capable of? What can I reasonably do? What does courage look like in this situation for me? And what will be courageous in a situation for one person will be cowardly for another person, or rash for another person. So, again, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. There's just no sort of a blueprint for what the right thing to do is ever at any time. So I think, maybe now is a good time to mention or to bring up that this is, in many ways, the theory of ethics that our legal system is based on. An Aristotelian idea of ethics, in the sense that we acknowledge that every case needs to be judged individually, and that we judge cases based on precedent, right? This case is like the other case, and so we can judge it similarly to that case. But that same idea of precedent acknowledges that a new particular case might call for a departure from precedents, right? It always leaves open the possibility that a new idea about the right thing in a certain kind of situation might arise. So I think, I could say a little bit more about that, but maybe we'll leave that for our discussion. Yeah. So just a little bit more recap about sort of basics of this idea of virtue being the intermediate, and the fact that that intermediate is a constantly shifting target that you need to find always anew, right? Again, for Aristotle, doing the right thing, being virtuous, means doing the right thing at the right time and for the right reason and in the right way. Right? We need to take into account all of these different sort of modalities of action, not just doing X, but how do we do X in the world, right? What is the timing of it? What is the sort of manner in which it's done? And what are the motivations for doing X, whatever that right thing is? So the fact that Aristotle takes into consideration the manner and the timing of this sort of action speaks to his broader metaphysical view of being, and to this idea of immanence that we mentioned in the last video. I think Aristotle is a thinker of immanence rather than transcendence. And this is a kind of simplified and schematic way of thinking about Aristotle as a thinker of immanence. But the important point is that what makes something right is not, again, that it is right in theory, but how it is enacted within the world, right? How it is manifested in the world, and its manner of manifestation, the way that it is brought into the world, when and how and for what reasons. In other words, its worldly, physical character is what makes a thing good, not just its abstract being. But so that's why Aristotle thinks the time, the manner, and the motivation all matter. Is that a thing can't be really evaluated, especially not something having to do with action and practice, except when it is manifested in the physical world. And I also then want to also re-underline this idea that what matters for Aristotle is the motivation behind an act, right? The act and the motive. Why we do something is very important. If we do something not because, not for its own sake, not because it is good or the right thing to do, but for example, I think I gave the example of if we give to charity to get a tax break, if we give to charity in order to get our name on a plaque, then we're motivated by selfish reasons and not noble reasons, and therefore the motive is lacking and the action is not going to be good. It's the motive matters. But what is equally important to grasp is that for Aristotle, this implies, or in Aristotle, what doesn't matter, or doesn't matter as much, isn't something that we need to evaluate, is the consequence of an action, right? What the consequence of an action is shouldn't be taken into consideration when we're evaluating the ethics of an action. The example that I gave was returning to the burning building example. I might make the right decision, right? I might judge that the right thing to do is to rush into the building to try and save grandma from the flames. And that would be the right thing to do. But I can't control what happens in the world. And I'm always subject to accidents, to that which cannot be predicted. And so if I rush in using the best possible judgment, and as soon as I enter the house, a burning beam falls, knocks me out, and kills me, that doesn't mean that I made the wrong choice. Right? The consequence shouldn't be part of my calculation, right? Or if I am deciding whether or not the person that rushes into the house and dies from a burning beam has done the right thing, I shouldn't take the consequence into consideration. Right? I can still say that the person did the right thing, even though the consequence was that they died. So this plays into this sort of larger idea in Aristotle uh, that the excellence of our actions, that our virtue is always subject to luck and fate, right? That we are not um, entirely responsible for what happens to us. And this is part of that idea of happiness uh, being not just our flourishing, well, or rather, let's say that happiness is flourishing, but flourishing is something that is not entirely up to us either. Right? That what it means to flourish is dictated by our essence, by the kind of being that we are. Right? I don't decide uh, what it means for me to be fully the thing that I am because I don't decide what I am. And so for Aristotle, happiness means flourishing. Flourishing means achieving your essence or becoming the thing that you are meant to be. Uh, we can think of this through analogy. Right? Uh, a plant flourishes when it comes to flower. Right? Similarly, analogously, a human being flourishes when it realizes the goal of its essence, which is right, to enter into uh, enter into political deliberation, to right enter into political debate and rational debate. The flower desires to flower. The plant desires to flower. But it doesn't choose flowering as its end goal, as its telos. The human being desires to uh, come into power, to uh, debate the truth, to know the truth, to have command over their own lives. But we don't choose to be rational political animals. We don't choose to have that goal. That goal is given to us. Furthermore, the flower can be frustrated by all different kinds of accidents that are beyond its control. Right? It can be eaten by a deer. It can be trampled by a human before it gets the opportunity to flower. It can freeze. It can have some kind of genetic uh, mutation that prevents it from coming to flower. There can be all sorts of things, both internal and external, that prevent it from achieving its goal, from flourishing. And this is true of human beings also. If we fail to flourish, we fail to become happy, it isn't entirely our fault. Right? We are also subject to lots of sources of frustration, reasons for failure, both internal and external. And so right, we only have a certain amount of control over our happiness. But Aristotle thinks there's no way around this. Right? This is just the nature of happiness, the nature of life, and the nature of action. But he thinks this is not to be lamented because it is under these conditions uh, that subject us to accident, to chance, to luck, uh, to all these forces beyond our control, it is those conditions that in the first place make happiness possible and through which we can conceive of happiness. And by that I mean that what happiness is, the reason why we want happiness, why happiness is valuable ultimately, what the excellent person achieves through their excellence in the end, is the ability to deal with the misfortunes of life, the ability to endure tragedy, accident, bad luck, failure. So at some point toward the end of book 2, when Aristotle is talking about all of the sources of unhappiness, he is discussing the things, right, the sort of conditions that lead to ultimate happiness, and what is promised by virtue, excellence at a minimum. And he says the happiest people must have two things. In the first place, they have to have strong moral character. They have to be virtuous. They have to be excellent, have practical wisdom, and have cultivated the habit of all these virtues: courage, moderation, liberality, justice, etc. But they also need something else. They also need blessedness. They need luck. They need a good fate, good destiny. They need the gods to be on their side. It is only through the combination of this strong moral character and good luck, the favor of the gods, only through the combination of those two that a person can become blessed. Whether or not a person has good luck or the favor of the gods is beyond their control. And so even someone that has the best moral character is not guaranteed this highest kind of happiness, this blessedness. But a person of strong moral character will always be happy in the sense that they will always be able to endure, to make the best of their bad luck and the tragedies that might befall them. So Aristotle says at one point, right, even those with the best moral character cannot achieve blessedness if they have a fate like Priam, right? Priam, Priam, it's Priam. Forgive me, I've forgotten my pronunciation of Homeric characters. It's really unforgivable. Let's say Priam. Let's say Priam. A fate like Priam. Right? Priam is the king of Troy and father of Hector. Right? If you know anything about the Iliad, Homer's epic poem about the Trojan Wars, which was the kind of Bible of ancient Greece, or one of the primary religious texts. You know that there's a war between the Greeks and the Trojans, the Achaeans and the Trojans, and that the Trojans lose, Troy falls, and this battle is played out in particular through the conflict between two heroes, Achilles and Hector, and Achilles kills Hector. So Priam is the father of Hector and the king of Troy, right? So he watches his son die, and he loses this long war and watches his city be captured and fall to his enemies. Aristotle says, right, Priam has a strong moral character, is an excellent man, right? Has all of the virtues. That doesn't guarantee that he won't have terrible luck, that he won't watch his son be murdered, that his city won't be sacked, that everything that he's worked for won't come to naught, right? He says, nevertheless, having a strong moral character is extremely valuable because it will help someone with such a terrible fate endure this horrible fate, endure these tragedies. And so, at the very least, what one can hope for from happiness is the ability to make the best of the situation, right? To play the hand that you've been dealt in the best possible way. That's the point of ethics, right? That is ultimately, from an individual perspective, that's the point of ethics. What do I get out of this? I get out of my virtuous habits the ability to put up with, to bear the vicissitudes of life, the ups and downs of life, and to be more or less happy as possibly can be, no matter what my circumstances are. And so that is ultimately the reward of virtue. And, I think that there's a lot of truth to this. There's even some, I think a little bit of overlap with Plato here in that, the person that only finds happiness and pleasure in, physical satisfaction, physical pleasure, or in the praise of other people, in honor or, nobility, or sexual desire, or in drinking. Any of these sort of low pleasures and lower forms of the good or happiness. People like that, Aristotle says, and Plato will agree, are ill-suited to deal with bad luck. They don't have the resources, the habits, they don't have the knowledge or the wherewithal to cope with and to endure hardship, right? If they know no other form of happiness besides physical pleasure or the praise of other people, then when those things are absent and they're taken away, as they are bound to be through the vicissitudes of life, changing luck, right, those people have no resources to make themselves happy in the absence of pleasure or praise. And so a large point of being ethical in an Aristotelian system, the idea of virtue ethics, is to find a source of happiness, source of pleasure, even in the absence of other forms of the good, of pleasure, and even, most importantly, in times of bad luck, in times of tragedy, right? To be able to make it through the bad times. So, let's turn our attention to a different question in Aristotle's Ethics, which is the question of how, in the first place, I'm able to recognize the good. So this is one of the difficulties of Aristotle's system of ethics, right? I have to develop good habits in order to become excellent and ethical and virtuous. Uh, and I can only learn what is good and virtuous through experience. I can't learn it through theory, to learn it through practice. And that means that I have to recognize it within experience. So, one of the questions when we're sort of giving a critical read to Aristotle that we want to ask is, how in the very first place do I recognize this excellent action, this virtue? How do I pick out in my experience the truly virtuous from what merely appears to be good? And Aristotle's answer is not wholly convincing at a kind of metaphysical level. But Aristotle answers that I learn to see the good, I recognize the good and the virtuous in the first place by witnessing the actions of other virtuous people. And the reason why this is not a satisfactory answer at a metaphysical level is right, that we have a problem of beginnings, a kind of chicken and the egg problem here, right? Well, there must have been some original good action that occurred without the aid of seeing some other prior good action, right? There must have been a first good action. But if we ignore that chicken and the egg problem for the moment, Aristotle's answer is acceptable, right? We learn the good, the virtuous, by experiencing other people doing it. I see someone do something virtuous, and in that experience, I recognize the difference between a virtuous action and a less than virtuous action, an excellent action and a poor action. Now, another sort of difficulty of this is, okay, I see someone do something virtuous. How do I come then to value that action as virtuous, as the most excellent, over other possible actions? Right? Because we remember the consequence is not essential, right? How do I see an action that I recognize as good in itself, regardless of the consequence of that action? In order to recognize the excellence of it, I would need either to see it be praised by someone, right? For someone to tell me that it's good, in which case I wouldn't be judging it to be good based on something in the action itself, but because, again, of praise, which Aristotle thinks is not the source of goodness, of excellence. I need to recognize virtue in itself. And so various philosophers have suggested that there is something, and Aristotle suggests this also in a certain way. Maybe we can get to this. It's something he mentions in book 6. Says that there's just something about virtue that is recognizable in itself. And that what it is we have an ability to sort of recognize this flourishing. We recognize when an action is aimed at our proper goal and telos as human beings. So it's that a virtuous action awakens an understanding in ourselves of what our true purpose is, so that through witnessing other virtuous actions, through witnessing the actions of other virtuous people, we come to understand what our highest calling is, right? The virtuous person awakens us to our highest potentiality as a human being. And so it is by sort of learning from witnessing the actions of other virtuous people that in the first place we discover what virtue is and what we ought to do. But there's another difficulty here. And we're finishing up. This is the last sort of theme from book 2 that I wanted to talk about, and we're transitioning to book 6 and 7, or 7 in particular. But this is the question of how one is able to develop a habit. How are habits formed? Not how do I recognize virtue, but how do I make virtue a habit? How do I change my habits? And this is a very difficult and complicated question, something that I think is really an interesting kind of dilemma for the immediate experience of ethics in our lives. How do I become better? How do I improve my habits? How do I change my habits? And the beginning of this is in seeing that excellent action in another person and wanting to emulate it. I am inspired to change my habits. Right? And the question of what inspiration is very interesting, right? But I think you can understand it as what I just described, right? That recognition of our own highest calling and purpose. I'm inspired to change my habits, but then I have to actually do that, right? And what is a habit? A habit is a custom. A habit is a way of being. It's a way of living. Now, what am I other than my ways of living? In thinking about how we're able to change our habits, the extent to which we can change our habits, we bump up against this very difficult question of whether or not people are good because of the things they do or because of something innate in them. Are there good people or are there only good actions? Aristotle has said, right? People are good because of the things they do. Anyone can become ethical, right? By changing their habits, by developing excellent habits. No one is, well, he's not going to say this, but one way we could sort of extrapolate Aristotelian ethics is to say there are no good or bad people. Everyone has the potential to develop good habits and to change their habits. And so no one has a kind of fixed nature. Everyone has the power, right, in certain radical interpretations of this, everyone has the power to be any kind of person they want to be. But I think Aristotle is right. Not that my opinion matters per se, but I think Aristotle is right to temper this idea and to say there seems to be something more going on with our habits than just what we decide to do. Which is to say, changing our habits seems to be easier for some people than for other people. But so let's just think about what it means to change your habits. What the extent to which habit makes you who you are, shapes your life. Aristotle also thinks that you become excellent by force of habit. Your habits make you the person who you are, give you your instincts to some extent. Right? If I have developed the habit of courageous acts, then when a situation arises that calls for courage, I will, by instinct, be courageous. If I don't have the habit of being courageous, when that situation arises, it's much more difficult for me to be courageous. Right? Habit is sort of what facilitates us to do one thing and not another thing. Habit and the force of habit is what makes it easy for us to do things. If you are in the habit of waking up at 7 in the morning, it's easy to wake up at 7 in the morning. If you're in the habit of waking up at 11, it's very difficult to wake up at 7. Right? Your habits dictate what paths are available to you. And so when we change our habits, we have to revert to some part of ourselves. We have to access some part of ourselves that is prior to or outside of that which is directed by our habits. Now, there's a lot of, and this is an extremely complicated question, right? Because what this is ultimately getting at is what part of ourselves is innate to us as individuals, right? Which is more or less like asking, what are the characteristics of our individual souls? And it's also thus asking how much of our lives is conditioned by the world around us, our culture and society, right? Our culture and society which give us most of our habits, right? You get up and go to school, you eat 3 meals a day, you shower every day. There's certain things that society expects of you, and you build your habits around those expectations. So how much of our lives is conditioned by society? How much of our lives is due to our individual souls? And then it's also asking how much power and freedom do we have as individuals to become whatever we want to be? Not small questions. But Aristotle thinks that there is some interplay between that which is innate in us and that which is formed through our habits. And so, right, we can think then of there being kind of three factors that go into our potentiality for our happiness. There is our moral character, which is developed through the cultivation of the right habits. There is the all those forces that can frustrate us or prevent us from achieving flourishing, right? Luck, accident, fate. And then there is our innate individual essence, which is also going to have an impact on our capacity to develop habits. In one sense, here's one of the sort of other major problems with Aristotle's ethics here that many philosophers have commented on, which is that in one sense, Aristotle thinks that in order to be in order to truly change your habits, and in order to develop the best possible habits, you have to have a certain kind of innate character, certain qualities of soul that are beyond our control, or your control as an individual, that can't be changed through changing your habits. So Aristotle sort of seems to want to say only the virtuous can become virtuous, but they can only become virtuous if they develop their habits in the right way. So how how much power we give to habit, how universal we think the power to change habit is kind of an open question. But what I'm building up to is this distinction that Aristotle makes between the continent and the incontinent man, continent and incontinent person, which he spends a lot of time talking about in Book 7. Right? Now, these terms are pretty strange, alien to us, continent and incontinent. But what he means by continent is, I think we could say, resolute, and by incontinent, irresolute. But I think the best way to understand these is in context. The continent person is the person that has a strong will, a person who's able to decide that they have to change their habits and then actually follow through on changing those habits. The incontinent person, the irresolute person, is the person who says, I want to change my habits, but is then unable to change their habits. Doesn't have the strength of will to change their habits. So let me, because this will become an issue later in the semester, mention something I think is interesting and important here, which is that for Aristotle, it's not a question of freedom. Do I have the freedom to change my habits? Everyone has the freedom to change their habits. The question is whether or not you have the will to change your habits. So for Aristotle, there is no question of free will. Freedom is assumed, which is in itself very interesting. Everyone has the freedom of choice. However, not everyone has the strength of will to follow through on their choices. Not everyone has the continence, the willpower to actually use their freedom. So, right, what's an example of this? We could think, all right, I need to stop eating a pint of ice cream every day. I need to read an hour each night before I go to sleep. I need to stop sleeping with my ex-boyfriend. I need to start going on runs every morning. I need to quit smoking, right? All of these are examples of habits that you might want to change in order to become more excellent, in order to be more virtuous. And maybe one of those examples is one that you can relate to, right? And so you might be familiar with how difficult it can be to change these habits. And one of the sort of major problems, or really, I don't think it's a problem with Aristotle's theory, it's a problem with that Aristotle correctly identifies. The problems with ethics is that so often we are incapable of doing what we mean to do. That our willpower doesn't meet our judgment, our practical wisdom. We can have correct judgment. We can have practical wisdom. We can know what the right thing to do is, but still we don't do it. And I think that is a really essential insight of Aristotle's. For one reason, because as he mentions in Book 7, this goes against Socrates and Plato. For Socrates, for Plato, if you know what the right thing to do is, you will certainly do it. For Aristotle, it's absolutely possible, and we see it all the time, as he says, that people can know what the right thing to do is and still do the wrong thing, right? Not do what they should do. So why does this happen? Right? And what does this mean for Aristotle's system of ethics? So I'm going to take a quick break here and start again in just a minute, talking about continence and incontinence and picking up these questions again.